Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another episode on Talk Architecture, and I am your host, Naziaty Muhammad Yaqub. So I'm glad to be back in the fray, but although I have a bit of a cough, I try to make it as smooth as possible in terms of your listening satisfaction. So the topic that I'd like to talk today is business to be taught in architecture school. So I came across a question by someone who's interested in this topic in threads. And this person posed this question of architecture schools need to offer business as an elective. We're spending 6 years in school, but graduate with zero clue to how to run a firm, price a project, or negotiate a contract in real world. Now, she also added, also financial literacy should be mandatory in every school. 2026, yet most of us still can't manage our money. So, one of the lecturers who replied this said that they include that in their latest curriculum review in their school. So, interesting to note that also others mentioned about 40 years ago, they certainly had subjects relating to business marketing, although their relevance to contemporary practice was pretty tenuous. So there's a lot of that. But I actually replied, and I'd like to expand on why I replied what I did. I said that business is not only financial literacy. I guess I look at it as an angle of how an architecture graduate, when they develop themselves in professional development, CPDs, that they could look into entrepreneurial development of their company. And how we look at it from a designer point of view is to look at design problems in a different way. So I did mention here that business is not only financial literacy. In the first year for our design theory assignment, as I recall, we tried to introduce marketing, because marketing is one of the things that you need to actually understand in business for students linking to a design problem. So when you transition to complete accountancy from architecture, you need to actually understand what are the offshoots, what are the things, the subsets or subjects that could come under architecture in terms of entrepreneurial development or entrepreneurial, shall we say, enterprises and startups that comes from an architecture graduate experience. So marketing is something that it's very obvious when you look at products that you design. Like in design theory, we had assignments where students of architecture actually find out the design problem, and then they would, we could ask them to find their own design problem, but we have to introduce what that is. Just say a wallet for an iPad, or an iPad stand, or iPhone stand, or maybe something to do with shoes, something to do with traveling, something to do with homeless shelter. Whatever it is, that's a product that they are designing, and they would actually build them in first year. And there happened to be a project that is to do with designing a product and displaying them. We have that in design theory, as I understand it. when I was teaching that subject. And it was kind of like a success because the more complicated the design problem is, the more complicated the product is. And what it is that how is that beneficial for them to understand marketing is that marketing doesn't come out of thin air. When people market their products, there is a story behind the product, and how the story is related to a narrative, and how the narrative is important when we sell a product. So eventually, students of architecture, even when they present their design work, which is, say, a building that they design, it could be a complex, a building, a high rise, or whatever, or design thesis, they would have to deal with the design problem. And one of the design problems could be to do with economy, or to do with the price or the cost of the building. And the reasons they chose certain materials or certain construction systems or the certain decisions on how it is to be done. For example, when in terms of scales of economy, the product is something that is durable, something that is flexible and can be retracted, assembled on site, for example, like market stalls, temporary market stalls. Or structures for people to pass through. So I remember the project on a street church and how that person designed the whole thing in detail, so that the whole setup of the church at a certain time, welcoming people on the street, and the street is closed off, is like architecture itself. And architecture cannot be deemed as something that is permanent. I mean, what is permanent? I mean, if you build a building out of concrete, how long will it last on that site? And before it's been renovated or being destroyed, completely renovated or completely destroyed and replaced by another building. So what I'm trying to say that, of course, there is a whole subject on how buildings learn, how buildings are sustained throughout the years, and what are the materials to be used. And under sustainability, there's a whole total subject on it. But when we think about an exercise in understanding design problems, it's just for students of architecture to understand, and so that they could see the process, see how things are connected, relationships. Then they could form ideas on learning about business. So that's why I mentioned about this design theory assignment, where they have to start thinking about marketing for their marketing, and meaning who are we selling this to? What is the target audience, and how do we narrate or we sell it with our story? And this relates to the design problem. How do you understand the design problem? Is it linking to the user? What are their needs? For example, if you're going to say a pocket wallet for an iPad or a tablet, or shall we say a laptop for students, then you're designing a bag that is, and you say for students of architecture, then that bag would have other needs, for example, or the way it's being used is different than maybe students who are doing accountancy. I mean, there's so many generic bags out there. So you start building up a design problem based on what is needed. So then the students in first year, they could understand already about the user requirement, because UI, UX is what happens when, there is a subject or a group of people, UI, UX designers, for the building of gadgets or phones, smartphones. And then they need to actually understand about user needs. You can introduce universal design as well, because in UI, UX, they use universal design a lot. For example, some principles of design. So you know that architecture is not a standalone fantasy thing that doesn't have anything to do with the real world, you see? So um, so I said further that gradually you can introduce a lot of other things like sales, costings, project management in studio projects, but clearly make them design problems or design problems related, which I again see this as a potential to actually for us to discuss, have a dialogue, a conversation about business, teaching business and architecture programs. So another thing that I would like to add is about sales, project management, and costings. I had um, an experience even way back in North London Poly, way back in the early 1990s. We had in the design thesis team someone who is have a background in economy, and they had this grand idea that you need to calculate the costs and benefits of your project. Just say you can't really just design out of purely from your own fantasy, and the cost is so much. It doesn't have any benefit to society, for example. And you can't do that. There needs to be like a feasible study of your design. So just say you have schematic design of what you design, and then you go through the site considerations or how you came about acquiring the site and your program in relation to what is in existing there. For example, that's what I did for my project. There was a building before I built on that site, and I did a cost benefit analysis with the help of the economists to show the value of what I am bringing to the local area and to the country by building or by proposing whatever I do against the private entity that it was before. I turned the private area into a public area. So anyway, what it was it wasn't something that we calculated in the beginning of the project, but I had a sense of justification by the assignment that I did under that economic analysis of the project. There could be a better word than what I said, but that was an assignment, and I did it. I put in the figures and the estimation of what the value of the building that I designed and gave a justification. So it was, at the end of it, like a little exercise to actually see that what I propose is something that is doable, that makes sense, that could be considered. It's not like something that is a fantasy and what shall we say it in English, but a rich man's toy or something, design. So we were all designing things that were of value at the time, as I recalled. People were doing museums and schools and stuff like that. So I guess it helped to go through that exercise that what we're doing is for society. So that was the design thesis in the 1990s. So now, at this day and age, probably there are more tools out there to actually do a business literacy or financial literacy to the project. And, if you imagine 3 years in part one and then 2 years in part two, you can find projects along the way that you could have project management, cost and benefits analysis. You can have sales as well. Sales would be that somebody will buy your project. So it's a pitch, sales pitch, a 3-minute sales pitch trying to sell your project to the audience. So it could be in a peer review mode, or in a way you could have a setting of how people pitch sales on their project. You could design a high-rise apartment building and you could pitch it to potential customers who are your it could be real potential customers, your mom and dad, or your pop and mom, people who can come into the studio, and you could present why the unit that you design, or the apartments that you design, cost that much, and you can have some sort of role playing where you can try to sell them. I think that what the person asked in threads is a very valid question, in which we all need to be serious about when we do the architectural curriculum. And what I like to state is the importance of how we need to get students of architecture to value financial and business literacy. When the person who asked the question about business, running a business, the entrepreneurial side is the easiest to explain, because you can imagine that you could sell a product, not necessarily architecture, but something you can make, a craft or something, T-shirts, for example, or some product you can make to others. And there is this subject that the university usually have called entrepreneurial studies. They would do, shall we say, merchandise, or they would sell things in a market event setting at the corner of the university, and they would get credits, subject credits, or pass or fail, or grades for them. So, but I think the most interesting thing about architecture, that it is traditionally a business sort of profession. When you look back in history, in the past, the architect tried to be skillful in a lot of things. They even would be a carpenter, or a shall we say, jewelry maker, or they would study those things, different types of material, and make those things. In the Bauhaus movement, for example, the Bauhaus School of Architecture was a curriculum on, they call it the Vaucours, and it has the students who could end up being architects, but they could be product designer or filmmaker and so on, and they dabble in being this Renaissance man thing, that you can be a stonemason, you can do sculptures like Michelangelo and his contemporaries. So this idea of the architect is a craftsman, as an artist, and also can do a lot of things like videography and so on, which actually some of them do. When we look at our students who have graduated, they are quite successful, or very successful, in whatever they pursued: filmmaking, photography, videography. Some became outrightly things to do with architecture, product design, batik artists, and it has to do with the architecture training. So architecture is traditionally something a profession that has to do with business traditionally. There are architects that work for developers, and they need to have that sense of being able to sell, or the skill to be able to have sales and marketing skills eventually. These things I find when I was a lecturer in School of Architecture, where you are aware that students of architecture need to be sensitive to this idea. We are not traditionally become government servants, for example. There are some courses that they eventually work in certain areas, like building surveyors. They would end up in property development, or in construction, and in local authorities, and similar to planners as well. They do go to business, but because we are designers, I mean, I'm looking at the built environment faculty. I'm not looking at the faculty that has more of creative arts and fields that are to do with design a lot. I'm looking at the other one, and we are more akin to that. That's why when we talk about architecture need to be like part of the creative arts faculty rather than this other group. But then that is something that is for another debate. So with that, I'd like to conclude about what I think, and this is a conversation that can be continued when we think about architecture graduates and the architecture curriculum that has business and financial literacy, and how that can be literally interpreted in the curriculum, in the programs themselves. Thank you very much.